So I'm going to introduce Dr. Robert Eyler. He'll give his presentation, and at the conclusion of it, we have the opportunity for questions and answers. We're going to try and limit it to about 3 minutes because we know that there will be quite a few questions, and we know that he will have some very good answers for us. So Rob Eyler is President and Head of Research at Economic Forensics and Analytics. He is Dean of the School of Extended and International Education at Sonoma State University, Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Regional Economic Analysis at Sonoma State, where he has been teaching since 1995. He earned a PhD from the University of California at Davis and earned a BA in Economics at CSU Chico. So we are very delighted, very honored, and are very much looking forward to Dr. Eyler's presentation.
Thank you, Wilda. Good morning, folks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. So, folks, my task this morning is to kind of walk you through what we've done for the last 6 or so months in trying to develop a strategy for Lake County going forward. I want to have some thanks just to get started. I want to thank the Workforce Alliance of the North Bay, the County of Lake, the supervisors, Lake County EDC and the staff have been an amazing help, and also the Project Task Force. How many folks in here were on the task force? If you just raise your hand with me at different times. Some of y'all weren't able to come to all of them, but I thank you again for your time on that. And I have some specific thanks to give. I know Monica Rosenthal's not here today, but she really is someone who was a spark behind a lot of this. I gave a speech almost 3 years ago today up here at Twin Pine Casino, and Monica kept in touch with me throughout this process, and then we actually got this thing done this year. Andy Lucas has been a great help. Thank you, Andy, wherever you're roaming around. Wilda, again, thank you. You were great on the editing and just sort of, keeping everybody in check. Michelle, thank you for keeping the county perspective in there and working with me on a lot of the details. And Bruce Wilson, who's not here today, as Stacy said earlier, but Bruce has been a big help throughout this as well. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with this process to date, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly walk you through the process we went through, the things we discovered, or the things I felt like that were the germane issues going forward, and then think about the next steps. These were the questions we tried to answer. What businesses will actually come, stay, and grow in Lake County? And rural California has a different challenge than, let's say, suburban or urban California in terms of answering those questions. So we wanted to use that lens where Lake County was the specific place of a test in that. What type of people will these businesses employ? So if you are able to attract and grow specific types of businesses, what's the workforce needs? Who do you have to train and get ready to work in those businesses, if at all? How is the government going to help or be a partner in those evolutions? And then finally, what infrastructure investments do you need to make? So every time we got together as a task force, and all the times I thought about what was going to happen at the final end of this process and project, these are the things I was thinking about in terms of the 4 major questions to ask. And I'm going to have 2 big questions going forward, as you'll see at the very end. So here's basically the path in terms of the punchline. When I'm gone and this project takes on another form, one of the things that I like to leave is sort of a path to walk on. So the first step is a setup path. And thinking about the financial partnerships you need to make, thinking about the tourism partnerships you need to make, because if tourism is going to be a thing going forward in Lake County, there's actual regional partners and other intra-county partners you need to make. And then finally thinking about wireless and broadband. So you're going to see that theme come up a lot here today, and I know that y'all have been slowly walking in some ways toward bits and pieces of broadband and wireless throughout the county. But if you're actually going to go through and attract a 21st century business, it's something you have to think about, not just specific sort of spots of wireless and broadband, but more general outcomes. So I feel like that's something in terms of setup you're going to have to watch very closely. Another big thing is messaging. So when you're walking forward, the messaging about Lake County and each city in Lake County and each part of Lake County, having a consistent county-wide message around all that. So I've heard as I've gone around, and I've been to all parts of Lake County over the last 7 months, and I've had family that have lived in Lake County. I have former wives that have lived in Lake County. The bottom line is that there's messaging about Lake County it's important, and this is also a big thing about rural California, is because there's fewer people than in a suburban or urban environment. Everybody kind of knows each other, either directly, indirectly, or maybe 3 or 4 concentric circles around your home. Basically, everybody knows everybody. So you start talking to each other, and there can be a negative feedback loop, but there can also be a positive feedback loop. So shaping that messaging is absolutely critical going forward. And that's especially true when you start contacting what I'm going to call clients later. The more and more you go out and try to grab onto businesses and even workers and try to attract them to come to Lake County and work in Lake County, you have to have a positive message about that. Now, granted, there's obviously the last 4 years have been very tricky because the fires have thrown a curveball in sort of consistent messaging where you're in command of it. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. The other piece is just preparing for growth. How do you message that this place is ready for what you're actually laying a path to do, not now, but 5 years from now? And having that messaging consistent, daily, looking forward all the time is a big thing going forward. The next thing is thinking about workforce and infrastructure and making investments. So 2 things that you'll see here is that you need curriculum, but really it's about lab space. And I say lab space in quotes, or I thought I did. I think about it in quotes because lab space is not just science. It can also be a laboratory of trying out new businesses, trying out different ways of doing business, of working, and ultimately also having hotel space. And when I say hotel space, I did put that in quotes. When I say hotel space, I just don't mean hotels for the sake of hotels. I mean places where people can come and work seasonally or for some length of time and then have another type of business rotate in. And you'll see that later when we talk about the science aspect that can happen with the lake and some of the things we're targeting in terms of industries. But that path is what happens in terms of going forward and having an economic development strategy, is walking on those stones, if you will, to a better tomorrow. And then once that happens in one way, you want to go back and start over again, or at least check back in and have kind of an annual assessment. In other words, don't just start on the path and then forget it ever happened. And 5 years go by and you say, oh, I wonder what happened to that thing. And you say, well, there goes another report on the shelf. The point of this path is that it will keep what I've done and what we've all done as partners in this from staying on the shelf. Because you'll annually assess what's the progress against what the goals were that we stated. And then there's some evolution in that every year. And then you start back on that path again as you need it. And then it becomes a more positive cycle. And that's key. And folks, just as another thing before we get deep into the details, I've done 3 or 4 of these projects around rural California, and rural California generally has a lot of the same issues, and we'll see that come up later. It's really a matter of saying, how are you different? What are you going to tell other people, especially outside of Lake County, that's an attractive thing to bring them here and want them to stay and grow? Okay, so one of the biggest concerns in this project was, what would we say in the data or just from what Lake County can support, we would say should be targeted as new industries or even the growth of industries. As we'll see in a minute, some of these are already here. The first one is actually thinking about science and using the lake or the recent disasters as a way of stimulating economic growth. In other words, turning a negative into a positive or a challenge into an opportunity. One thing you can do is actually look at the lake as an experimental ground all by itself. UC Santa Barbara, for example, has the #1 lake science program in the world. Why not engage professors who are there and bring them here to do science and then have these concentric circles of growth happen in jobs around that, because it's coming every year in a cyclic way. That's one of the things we're saying, is that let's look at ways of actually attracting science, and I'll get back to why in just a second. The agricultural supply chain, thinking about, you have agriculture here, are there different nodes of the supply chain, meaning distribution, manufacturing, and retail, that you can bring to Lake County or maybe center in Lake County with other community partners and other state partners to just link up those pieces? Why is that important? It's important for one big reason. The more you can vertically integrate an industry, the more you capture the dollars generated by that industry. When you just have one part of the supply chain and you don't have 2 or 3, you can lose and have what you would call leakages in economics out to other places. So if you can capture some of that, especially if it's going to happen near here anyway, it's a good thing to do. One thing that does stimulate in terms of questions is the role of cannabis in the next stages of agriculture throughout California. And it's been a funny evolution, and we're not going to go too deep into that today. So if you wanted to see a lot on cannabis, it ain't going to happen here today, because we've got other things to talk about. But it's one of many possibilities looking forward, because it's basically an agricultural product one way or the other, whether you see it in the legal sense or the illegal sense. And thinking about that as one, like I said, of myriad possibilities is out there. One thing about Lake County, we'll come back to this later, is the quality of life. There are a lot of people who espouse the quality of life in Lake County as differential from other places. Well, is it possible to attract people to live here that are bringing businesses with them? In other words, don't look for the large employer, but look for smaller employers who may operate out of their houses initially or out of a larger parcel that they basically are the owner of, and then see if they can't attract some jobs. One of the biggest examples I've used when we've been talking since 2015 on this is the city of Healdsburg kind of got a serendipitous boost in aerospace. Why? Because 5 or 6 engineers from General Dynamics moved to Healdsburg and started doing gig-style contract business in aerospace, and before they knew it, they had 100 employees. Okay? Healdsburg, California, doing rockets, right? How does that happen? It happens because the people that were attracted there found themselves in a so-called cluster and started to feed off each other, and they had a global business model, not just local. They didn't go there and open a candle shop. They went there and they started to design airplanes and rockets. Okay? That ended up feeding other businesses, but the point is they actually created jobs basically out of their homes. That's a possibility in a place like Lake County because, again, it's a quality of life issue. They moved to Healdsburg in their mind for quality of life. They ended up generating a scientific business out of it. So that's something that Lake County can kind of sell. If you think you can sell the quality of life, then you should be able to also sell the quality of doing specific types of businesses where the quality of life is a key decision node for someone to actually move and have a business here. And then finally, which is classic, is tourism or visitor support. So Lake County does not want to lose the tourism business, but it's really more about enhancing it in a way that's a little bit more sustainable and perhaps a little less seasonal. And there's a real trick in that. It's not easy to do that. And I don't have a panacea for the problems in tourism in Lake County, nor a perfect path forward. But just thinking about packaging and messaging at another level makes you more competitive against a regional marketplace that in the last 10 years, looking at just Napa and Sonoma County alone, has become way more competitive. So you just can't sit on your laurels. You got to start thinking in the same way and how are you going to drive people here and then try to capture as much of their spending once they're here as possible. How do we filter those? In other words, how do we come up with those 4? Well, generally when you do analysis about targeting industries, every place is a little bit different. So the first one is think about what types of businesses would actually look outside Lake County initially for marketplace. Doesn't mean it would abandon the marketplace here, but which ones would actually derive their income primarily from places beyond Lake County. Why is that critical? Because then you're not just subservient to what happens locally in terms of driving your business, and that those dollars, when they come in, they circulate. So a lot of countries like exports because you generate income from somewhere beyond, and when you do economic development analysis, it's almost doing like micro-international analysis, thinking that you're this little country, and how do you drive business towards you from outside to enhance what you have inside economically without having to generate it from the inside. So that export focus is key. And if you notice, going back real quick, all 4 of those have some external component to them. The next one is trying to increase economic mobility and the idea that you're actually hiring or generating business that has higher than average wages and trying to pick everybody up. So one of the biggest questions in the last, let's say 7 or 8 years, specifically after the recession ended, was what was going to happen to wages, in a sense, income distributions in the wake of the recession. And a lot of rural California has seen the so-called distribution of wages, or the lowest wages to the highest wages, stay relatively stagnant. Where urban California has seen them move to the right. In other words, they're all moving up towards higher wages or better so-called economic mobility, trying to get out of poverty, trying to get a chance to own a home, to generate more wealth. Those types of businesses can do that. Again, why? Because they're export focused and have higher than average wages. Also, the other thing, and this is also critical, how many people here have thought about, wow, why doesn't Lake County actually try to get Google to come here? Has anybody ever had that fleeting thought? Come on now. Well, thank you for admitting that. I appreciate that. So a lot of rural and suburban California started to see this or think this belief, well, you know, the Bay Area is going to suddenly outgrow itself, and at some point the ROI of staying in the Bay Area was going to pop and these folks were going to leave. So why not just go 70, 80 miles north and come here? Look at the quality of life, right? And that theme's going to keep coming back up, so hold on to that too. But why not just move here? The calculus of moving a high-tech business to a rural place is very, very tough on the decision to actually move to that rural place, right? If you've been watching the news about Amazon's decision making, they ended up in kind of a rural-ish place as far as that eastern seaboard goes, but they're very close to DC in the end. They're in places that there's logistics, that all the things that they need are there, right? How do you sell that? So you got to think about, okay, well, if you can't sell that easily because you're not that big and you're not that diverse for a different audience, you need to try to utilize what you have. So that's the key. So as a foundation, to get the thing started, didn't want to walk too far outside the box. The lake and what's been happening recently as science. Tourism, we already have that. Agriculture, already have that. People that move here because of quality of life, they may have a business, kind of already have that. But that gets the wheel spinning, and that's the key, is to utilize Lake County and what you already have, rather than try to think about what you might be able to do, but then 5 years will elapse and you say, wow, we had all these other good assets, we never utilized them. Biggest theme probably at the end of the day, what makes you different? You don't see a lot of that stuff otherwise. You don't see a lot of rural California immediately go to agricultural supply chain and try to expand that, or try to attract specific types of science that feed off the assets or potential challenges that you want to turn into opportunities locally. Those things really don't come up. What a lot of people do is they kind of figure, well, we'll just kind of grow what we have and keep on trucking, rather than thinking a little bit outside the box, but how you can utilize those assets, and you have to be different. How is Lake County different than Colusa? Don't answer that yet. But those are the kind of things you got to be thinking about. Colusa, Tehama, Mendocino County. How are you different? Because at some point, those counties are going to be asking the same exact questions y'all are, and trying to do exactly the same thing, more or less, because they're facing the exact same challenges in some cases. Okay, so that's the targeted industries piece. Now let's talk about infrastructure. So in the short term, the supposition is that there will be some pretty vehement discussion about broadband and wireless and its expansion. That's necessary. The hotel space and thinking about the commercial space and what industries should be targeted, I'll come back to this later. But the utilization of commercial space is a big deal, right? Two things on that. One is that, I'm going to say this later in a little more detail, but you want to look at commercial sites specifically to the target industries. So you probably get a lot of attraction in certain ways, mainly retail, and sometimes lower end retail. Why? Because the decision process, the 4 or 5 boxes to tick for some of those, are very straightforward for Lake County. Let's put a Dollar General here. Let's put a 99-cent store here. Let's put another small grocery store here. Why? Because there's a little bit more population and it seems like, okay, now we can tip it over. Why would a company come here and take on commercial real estate? You have to be able to sell it to them as much as they want to sell it to you. And it's that kind of a partnership that's the next step. So thinking about that commercial space for targeted industries only, you're making a commitment to specific types of industries, have your spaces commit to the same thing. And that hotel space is another big deal, both in the tourism support side, but also on the business support side. Because you may have somewhat seasonal movements through here for the next couple of years. Where would they stay? So the identification of the possibilities there is another piece of commercial real estate that a lot of communities don't talk about. They say, well, I got 25 sites over here, and it's this old industrial space, or used to be this retail, or it used to be this restaurant. So why not just put something back in there that's the same? That might fit, but you still got to find someone who wants to be there long term, because you don't want to go through this again 3 years from now. You got to think like they are. In other words, think like a site selector. And that's a big difference, and in some cases, that's a big cultural evolution for a community. The other thing is water and sewer. I know that Lake County EDC just put a report together about a lot of the CEDS, or the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy targets in terms of how to spend money and enhance water, sewer, and roadways. Starting on that is good. In the long term, the airport and roadways, you definitely want to fix those. And one of the things I put in the report is the airport. Folks, again, if you think about bringing in different types of businesses, those assets make you differentiable, but they're not overnight fixes. It'll take a little while before you get there. But having it, again, long-term, in your strategy, in your planning, when's it going to happen? Let's put it out there 3 or 4 years from now, and we have to start today in trying to find the financials to make that happen. So these are what we identified basically as the infrastructure needs, with some emphasis on the short term. Another big piece is workforce. Now, I'm going to say this because I think it has to be said. Folks, 10 years from now, there are jobs that we don't even know yet, right? And it's also possible that the jobs we know now will not be there in 10 years. What's really tough for an educator is I have students in my classes who I'm telling you need to get an economics degree, but I don't have a clue what they're going to do with that economics degree unless they go to graduate school 10 years from now, right? And that's usually the holy grail for most of us as professors. We want everybody to go to graduate school. We know that's not possible. But we make promises that sometimes our rear ends can't cash. Right? We really struggle with this as educators. And that's true all the way through high school and up. So when we think about workforce needs, the tension there is that you have to balance between what you think is going to be there, but also the hardball reality that you're going to train some folks who are then going to have to make a career transition later. So one of the things you want to do to try to keep yourself from stumbling, is to continually talk to local and regional employers. Both. Don't just talk to local. Why? Because in rural California, generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of high school graduates who are going to leave. And that's just part of the gig. Okay? So you want to be able to positively train people for careers that you don't have locally. But you want to talk to local employers about how you might be able to pipeline in, especially if you see targeted industry growth. Because then that cycle will just start to spin through curricula all the way up. And staying close to them is good. In terms of the supply chain, if you do expand that supply chain, you're going to need jobs in manufacturing and distribution and packaging and processing. And that expansion, depending on what industry it's in, training workers for that is another big thing as you go forward. On the tourism side, do you have customer service programs? Do you have hospitality management programs? If you don't train those folks locally, guess what you're going to have to do if you grow? This one's actual question. You have to bring them in from the outside, and to bring them in from the outside, what do you think you're going to have to do to entice them to come in? Probably pay them a little more, right? So training local people for those kind of jobs, if you see them coming, is good. And if you see that there's actual gaps, because the employers are telling you there are gaps, listen to that. Another real bad thing and a pothole that educators get into is that, for a multitude of reasons, we don't like to adjust quickly. Right? That sounds good, thanks for telling me this, but I'm going to keep teaching the things I'm going to keep teaching and they'll figure it out, rather than having curricula sort of shift toward what employers want. And that's attention, and that's something, again, having education, the employers, and the community members all talking as one group about that and planning, staying in touch is key. On the science side, preparing folks for potential laboratory work, coding, the computer piece of it versus just the science piece of it. If you do get some science to come here, being able to say that you can actually support that in relatively low-level jobs without those folks having to import those low-level jobs, and having a lab space here is another big plus. And that's a story you get to tell. So remember, we started with setup, messaging, and then workforce and infrastructure. Well, we just walked through all that, except for the messaging piece. But that's where the spin really happens. What are these folks going to go out and tell other people about Lake County that then it'll drive more later? And then it just becomes almost like a positive feedback loop onto itself, and you grow. And you don't have to do as much 2 or 3 years from now, because the first couple of years you made the great investment. So watching that expansion of curriculum and trying to think about the science piece is key. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about data. Another thing about economic development strategies is you want to sort of pinpoint specific data points that say, okay, this is how we're improving, or this is where we need more help. So we talked about this a little bit. One is in TOT growth. So transient occupancy tax is something that, especially if you have a tourism-based economy, or one in which it's a relatively large part of your economy, seeing that grow can help you think about whether your tourism strategy is actually working or not working, but it can also tell you something about the supply side. So tourism growth is something that you want to say is pure demand, and that's not true. If you have more hotel rooms, you're going to see TOT growth, even if occupancy slips a little bit, because you might have more rooms selling to visitors. So you want to watch both sides. So I didn't say TOT growth purely on the demand side, but the analysis of whether or not you're getting more rooms identified, more people paying TOT, and more people staying, you want to keep up on all those metrics inside of TOT. Sales tax growth is kind of the same thing. If you attract more sales tax paying businesses, you might get dollars growth. So you want to look at how much more you're attracting businesses, but also the number of the amount of dollars that are growing as well. This is a tough one because the data on the education of the workforce is a little tricky to follow, but I'm saying here that you really want to focus on the 18 to 24-year-olds. If you look at rural California, there's a metric or a picture that's called the population pyramid. And the population pyramid is kind of big on the bottom and small on top naturally, but rural California kind of looks like a top, where it's kind of small on the bottom and then kind of loses a little bit in the middle and then bows way back out because it's aging and then tops out. Why? Because you're missing that sort of 18 to 30-year-old workforce that gets educated, leaves high school, goes away, and then in some cases actually considers coming back. How many people here grew up in Lake County, left, and came back? Okay. So that's not as many as I thought there would be. How many people just never left Lake County? Okay. So the algebra means the rest of y'all came here from some other place. But the bottom line is that when you think about that, if your strategy is working, the level of the workforce in terms of their education and what they're bringing back here, you should see some movement in the 18 to 24-year-old group. Okay? Because those younger workers are going to be attracted to that place when it's actually growing, and that should help. The other thing is in the targeted sectors, and it's a little tricky, because you can say, okay, in the professional side specifically, on the science side, you may have workers that in fact will only be tracked where they get paid. So if you bring in science that's seasonal, and that folks being paid, or those folks are being paid in Missouri, but they come here for 6 months, the data will never show up in Lake County. So you want to really watch that closely, but that means you got to keep your eyes on everything. Just don't use the government data alone. You got to be your own tracker of the data, and you have to get a little bit more robust in that. So watch that closely. This is another one a lot of people like to fixate on commercial vacancy. Okay? Well, there's certain lots at this point that probably should remain vacant by the nature of where they are and what they are. So watching the types of businesses that come in and how if vacancy starts to drop because you're actually getting more infill or just more growth, what's being filled and where is just as important as just that one piece of data as a percentage of the total. Something I kind of recommended was doing a quality of life metric. If your intention is to sell quality of life, a good thing to do is make it comparable to other places so you can actually tell a story about why, in a cold-blooded data way, you have a better quality of life than some other place, rather than just say it, we have a better quality of life. Okay? If you travel around Northern California, almost every community's got the same messaging, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So one thing to do as a metric is actually put something together that says, these are the things we're worried about in Lake County in terms of quality of life, and we want to compare that to other places to show how strong we are. The caveat, you might do that, and then you might go, uh-oh, when I actually do this comparison, we're about in the middle. I thought we'd be really close to the top. But the beautiful thing about that is, that tells you got some challenges that you can focus on and try to creep that thing up. Okay? Again, the data can tell you things that really should steer the ship more than anything else, or make sure that you're doing it right. Shouldn't be the be-all, end-all. Another big step that's tough is providing incentives. And a lot of communities are struggling with this and have since redevelopment ended. So the first thing you could do is do a short-term TOT holiday. So I just said maybe you want to look at TOT growth as a good thing. Okay, that's true. But there may be a way of actually saying, look, if you are doing an Airbnb and you've been kind of under the radar and you haven't been paying TOT, or you've been doing VRBO, or you've just been kind of doing it on the side. Providing that holiday says, look, we want to identify you as a place because we're doing this strategy where we're going to need more quote-unquote hotel space. If we can identify you for 1 year or maybe 18 months, we're going to give you a TOT holiday. We just want to put you on the books, and there's a business that's coming to help you. So you're going to get more revenue, and you're going to be able to pay the TOT, but you don't have to pay it for the next 18 months. You're just going to have to identify. Then you'll get it later. But that's tricky for a lot of communities because they see the TOT as this beautiful, fungible dollar amount. All we got to do is attract another hotel, and it washes bills away. You still got to have the occupancy. So if you know that there are properties that have almost by their own accord this sort of continuous group of people coming in, but they've been sort of lying under the radar, you have a choice. You can either go hardball on them and say, well, you've been a scofflaw, and now I got to break you down now. Well, that might stop the flow. Or you can have your arms open and say, what we'd like to do is provide you an incentive to come into the ring. We're going to give you a little holiday to do that, but now you have more and more sites identified to support the other things you're trying to do. Like I said earlier, doing it like a site selector and looking at commercial space. You have an opportunity zone now in Clearlake. Looking there at what that means is also another tricky thing. The tax break may not attract anybody initially, but if you say, look, I got 5 sites that I want to provide out there on the marketplace, and I really want to focus on our targeted industries, doing it like a site selector is key. Can you provide any relief? Is there any relief you can do? Just that one little step on the margin can help. And then thinking forward a little bit. One of the things I'm recommending is that you should look at what happened before the Valley Fire as the time of the dinosaurs, that everything kind of changed after that for Lake County, right? And so what that does, I hope, is it gets you out of the trap of thinking, oh, we used to do this in 2005, or we used to do this in 2001, or I used to do this in 1989, right? Great. But that might as well have been, like I said, the time of the dinosaurs. Got to think more forward. So part of that is trying to think, well, what can I go out and find? Can I actually do bond financing in a special way? But what you can do is like what you call an IFD or an EIFD. Set up a small area in which you can actually do that where the tax incentive bonds happen. It's very tough to do that because when you have lower public revenue already, committing it to something else is a very tricky political process. The beauty of my situation is I can recommend all this and y'all got to figure out how to do it. Okay? And it's not easy. And I don't want to say it's easy, but one thing to think about is A, things have changed. The second thing to think about is that you're not alone in those changes. The landscape has become way more competitive just in the last 3 years, much less in the last 10. Okay? So thinking about incentives and how you can actually compete. What are you going to have to do? What can you commit to that's actually new for Lake County? That might be kind of a bold step, but it's something that you might need to do for competitive sake is key. And like I said, a lot of communities struggle with this gamble, because that's what it really is. In some ways, it's a bet. We had 5 community fora in the last 4 months. I'll actually take that back, from the end of June to the end of October, which is about a 4-month period. 3 big themes popped out. A lot of people concerned about infrastructure in Lake County and whether or not it's going to support businesses and residents long term. There were concerns over the fires repeating annually and becoming a real problem for residents, and they're wanting to stick around. And finally, residents concerned over whether or not, if you invoke a strategy that potentially changes the nature of Lake County, is that going to change the reason I moved here? Will quality of life change necessarily for what you're telling me you're going to recommend going forward and its execution going forward? These are big themes, and almost every single thing we heard in those community forums ended up coming under, I should say, one of those umbrellas. Okay? I actually had a big continuum. I had some people say, well, you didn't ask anything about the government. I don't like the government. Well, I didn't ask anything about the government because whether you like the government or not, the government has to be a partner in all this. Okay? So the other thing is I asked more or less positive questions, and a lot of people gave negative answers. People want change, but they want it in a way that's shaped. And for some folks, it just means there's going to be some loss. It's unfortunate, but economic development, just like anything else, there's an opportunity cost in it. We've got to watch for that. So the community forums brought those things up as things to watch in terms of the messaging later. Exactly. Having that community unity is key. Okay. So from a core project standpoint, those were a lot of the main deliverables in terms of the recommendations going forward, but there's extras coming up. And so we want to start thinking ahead. There's some things that have happened over the last 6 months that we want to watch in terms of having a context about what's around us. One is interest rates are rising. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because we all tend to use capital markets for a lot of different reasons. And if I'm going to take on debt, why am I taking on debt to come to you when that cost of debt is rising? What are you telling me you're going to do for me in a rising cost environment? So we got to watch that. And there's actually some folks out there predicting an economic slowdown sometime around 2020. How many people here went to the event in Santa Rosa a few weeks ago called the California Economy Project? Okay. You may or may not have caught this, but I'm telling you this because it was in the public sphere. Betty Yee, state treasurer, who writes my checks every month, said very quickly in a 5-minute interview that her staff is preparing for the downturn in 2020. Not a downturn or a possible downturn, but the downturn in 2020. Now, whether she said that off the cuff or she didn't have her data right, it's kind of immaterial. But when that kind of stuff leaks out from Sacramento, from the treasurer's office, that means they're already starting in Sacramento to think, wow, from a public finance standpoint, I got to start thinking in 2020, if we're going to see a slowdown in economic growth, we're going to start to see a slowdown in tax revenue and all the other pieces that run Sacramento. Some are predicting that. Why is it important again? You got to think, if you're going out there on an economic development strategy, what are the risks in doing that? And what do you got to see forward and be able to say, well, if I go this direction initially, this environment might be a little bit more interest and economic, let's say, economic growth sensitive to these other projects. And they may all be sensitive to a certain extent, but you want to keep that in mind, which ones are more sensitive to the others, and try to shape around the economic cycle. The recent fiscal policy packages coming out of Washington have some confounding effects on California. On the agricultural side, on the trade side, farmers have probably a little bit more positive outlook going forward. At the same time, for Californians, we kind of got hammered in terms of the tax breaks, and it depends on where you live. For Lake County, it might be more in the middle, and y'all might have more net positive effects than, let's say, in places like San Francisco or Los Angeles. But there's a lot of confounding effects on there depending on how wealthy the community is or how agriculturally based the community is going forward. There's been growth across the board. So 2011 is basically the year in which the recession finally ended for most of California, including Lake County, and we've seen growth throughout the North Bay and Lake County ever since then. But the growth has been different in Sonoma and Napa counties than Lake and Mendocino counties. And what's been tough to watch is Lake and Mendocino County have sort of separated themselves by being a little bit more slow growth than Sonoma and Napa counties have. But it doesn't mean that Sonoma and Napa counties have grown in the correct way for those communities either. And Napa County, where I'm speaking tomorrow morning, is really at a juncture where they have to think about what they want to be 5 years from now, because they're starting to grow up very quick in Napa County. Okay? They have water issues, traffic issues, housing price issues, wage issues, but they have a lot of cash flowing around Napa County at the same time. So we've seen growth that's a little bit different, and we want to monitor that. Why? Because adjacent counties tell us something about where partners are and what might be coming for y'all. And the competition's gone up, and that's really, I think, the key message here about the context is that while you think that you're special here in Lake County, and you are, every other community thinks the exact same thing, and competition has gone up. And if most of the flow comes from the south-north, there's a gigantic fishing net sitting there waiting to grab all that stuff as it's coming. And you got to be thinking about how do you get them to walk right through that and come to you? Or how can you partner and have them come to both? Okay? Or a mix of those strategies, and that's key. So I'm going to show you two graphs real quick that expand this into a forecast that may shock you a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't. But this is something just as a working hypothesis that, will Lake County always have this dichotomy? You got about 29,000 residents that have a job, according to California EDD, but you only got about 17,000 people who actually work in Lake County. Now, it doesn't mean that all 17,000 come from the residence pool. That's not true. But in net, in terms of flows, you got more supply than demand, so these folks are going to be working some other place. Okay? So you're going to have people leaving the county, at least for right now. The beauty of that is that you can actually take some of that difference and say, wow, there's got to be an opportunity now to attract some of those folks to not commute anymore and actually work here. I wonder what skills they have. That data, or those data, are available. Okay? Part of the workforce strategy. The reason I brought up that meeting a couple weeks ago in Santa Rosa is because these data right here came out right before that meeting in a partner project between Caltrans, who's thinking about where they're going to put infrastructure over the next 40 years, and the California Economy Project. This is what they're predicting in Lake County for the next 10 years in terms of percentage growth by industry. So they're actually expecting about 13% growth of total wage and salary jobs in Lake County over the next 10 years, a little bit more than 1% per annum, where most of that's going to be in health and education. Okay? And when you look at that, what immediately pops out to you that's not there? What type of number on the number line doesn't show up? No, that's a whole different ballgame. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. It's not on there, that's correct. That's right. But if we think about sort of the classic job we would attract short of the self-employed, what you see, there's no negatives, right? There's no industry that's looking to contract. If you look at Sonoma County, they think that construction is actually going to contract in Sonoma County. In Napa County, they think finance and construction are going to contract. Why? Because the cost of living is going to rise faster in those places, and there's going to be a reason for those industries to move some other place, where none of that's happening here. So the good news is that you're seeing growth almost across the board except for information, which is publishing and software, and there's a lot of rural California that has zero growth there, so don't think that that's a big deal. But here's where it's a little bit more dubious. That was percentage change. This is the actual number of new jobs. Okay? So that 13% is about 2,300 more jobs, but look at how much of that gets sucked up into healthcare and education versus a lot of these other ones that have barely 100 jobs of growth over the next 10 years in that prediction. Okay? Where is the focus of this strategy? Mainly in here and a little bit here. What's cool about that is that they're predicting something from the past, which means there's got to be some opportunity if you do something a little bit different going forward. Okay? But why this is really important is because these data are actually hitting the desks in Sacramento for your elected officials in Sacramento. The point of these forecasts is this is meant to be the main forecast in policymaking now for a little while. Okay? So watch these things very closely. This just came out 3-4 weeks ago. Okay. Now, another part of this project was to try to find other communities to watch. So I gave you some metrics to follow before. And now what I want to do is I want to show you some so-called peer and aspirant places. So in terms of peer, Tehama County, Yuba County, and county in Oregon called Yamhill. Does anybody know where Yamhill County is? A little bit? Good. We looked at those as peer for 3 main reasons. 1, relatively rural, somewhat close to a major suburban or urban area. Yamhill is relatively close to Portland. But the other piece is that each one of these, if you look at the way they market themselves as a place to come and live because of, guess what? Quality of life. Okay? Not too far away from the city, but far enough away to get away. How many people have thought about Lake County as not that far from the city, but far enough away to get away? Right? As just one of many messages you've heard over time. Okay? But if you look at other data, the personal income per capita, the median household income, the wage levels, the number of employees, the population sizes, all relatively similar in all 3 of those places. As aspirant, Mono County, California, Deschutes County, Oregon, and Kootenai County in Idaho, where Coeur d'Alene is in Idaho and where Bend is in Oregon, and then Mono County. Why? Rural areas, ag and tourism stacked on top of each other, but some science happening there as well, and bringing in a much larger crowd and having proximity in such a way that they're feeding off of those pieces in another area. So Coeur d'Alene's relatively close to Spokane, Washington. Its airport, its universities, its workforce. Bend feeds off both Oregon State University and the University of Oregon a little bit in terms of science that comes in. They just put another campus in Bend. And in Mono County, which is a total left turn on that, Mono County is a relatively small place. How many people here have been to Mono County at least one time? Okay. Their strategy is twofold right now. They put the flag in the ground. They want to drive younger people to Mono County as a place to visit. Why? Because they've made infrastructure investment in broadband and actually brought chain coffee there. Okay? There's a lot of places that resist that and don't want to provide the incentives for that to happen. Mono County's done that. And they actually have an airport that accesses most of the major hubs in California as well. So that's all they're doing. They're just doing tourism, and that's about it. So they've kind of stuck themselves on that strategy, but it's something to watch because that type of place is going to attract a strategy some other areas of California where you're not just a one-trick pony, you have more diversity, and how can you do it right? This is the messaging you get from most of those places. Have a quick read in that for the next 20 seconds. Quality of life. Cost of doing business is lower. Quality of workers is high, and we're very engaged as a community. You can shape your own possibilities. And has anybody ever said that about Lake County at some point in your past? The reason I put this up here, folks, because I heard this over the last 6 months continuously. And if you look at the marketing strategies of these aspirant places and even some of the peers, they're saying the same exact stuff. Why? Because they totally believe it. They're dyed in the wool on this, and that's great. You want that out of community members. Okay? But you're not alone. That competitive aspect is key. So watching the evolution of these places can tell you competitive aspects for Lake County, but also where you might want to go. So to get these things done, there needs to be some financial investment. We talked about this already. How do you use the money? Where can you actually do TIDs or other business improvement districts? Where are you going to pay for the infrastructure? Thinking about that going forward. You also need to pick some projects right away. Broadband is something I've been hanging my hat on, potentially thinking about airport renovations. These are purely examples. They're not to-dos or must-dos, except for the broadband piece, which I'm really fixated on. But you want to get a couple things going relatively right away. I've done these projects where I leave, and then everybody kind of looks around at each other, then something happens, a recession, a fire, an earthquake, a hurricane, something happens, and then 6 or 8 months go by, and then all we're doing is regrouping. And it's the same thing all over again. If you get a couple projects going right away on these nodes, you will start walking on that path, and at least you'll have momentum going forward. So having some projects going right away is key. You might want to put, like I said earlier, a new financial district forward in the report. There's some ways to look at those financial districts and what you can do. But thinking about financing that is key going forward, and you got to think, how are we actually going to pay for it and not necessarily come out of pocket initially on that. There are some ways in doing that, some tools. Okay, we have an opportunity zone. So is there any strategy right now to go out and try to utilize that opportunity zone as we know it? Think about that. Is there something out there? And second, Colusa County is a partner in this. Can you jam those two together, right? There are some opportunities, but it's not as easy as just saying that, you can get a deferment or an elimination of the federal tax piece. Come. There's competition, but partnering is key. So go to Colusa County and find ways that you can come together. One of the things I have as a sub-strategy, if you're going to do agricultural supply chain, you partner with Colusa County, utilize I-5, and have everything moving that way. I understand that Highway 20 is not the greatest infrastructure on planet Earth, but it is a way of looking at a partnership that you otherwise may not get. So watch that closely too. Who will be your messenger? So Lake County EDC should be cast in that role if it's going to be the countywide economic development corporation. And being that messaging hub and project lead, you need someone to carry the flag. So if you're going to put together more financing for EDC or any agency, two questions you may want to ask right away. What are going to be the deliverables? If I write you the check, what are you going to do for me? And then second, are there some projects that you already have underway that we can jump on right now and actually move forward? And EDC put that report together in terms of block grant funding and some other things that are already cooking forward. So just thinking about what you can do, and that's low-hanging fruit just to get started. The toolbox, there's a lot of stuff out there. I've kind of already said some of this, but thinking forward, the key is having a commitment. You've got to be able to say, we're going to make this investment now, and we're going to make it in such a way that we want to see this come to fruition. What a lot of communities do, they do 1 year funding and say, okay, we're going to test drive it. Then that 1 year goes by, and there's no results. That's because it's a long-term strategy. You may not get anything for 1 year. You may just get the process started and say, well, we're not refunding it because I didn't get any of my deliverables in. Or some political problem comes in. You have to make a countywide community commitment to whatever you do, not now, but actually probably for 3 to 5 years in a row, just to see what happens. Again, it's another gamble. Politically, you're all going to have to figure that one out. This is one model of how to draft that funding up for whatever agency. If it is Lake County EDC, start with county funding, then maybe the city of Clearlake, city of Lakeport. You could split it up in other communities depending on how it's financed in the unincorporated areas. You can find grant funding. You might find other agencies like EDA or USDA to come in, and then you may get some in-kind. And it's okay to get in-kind or corporate funding to come in and reduce some expenses. For example, you might find there's a PR agency in Lake County who would want to, as a piece of philanthropy, provide you with labor and resources around messaging, because they already have global links in place. You don't have to do all that heavy lifting. So that might be part of this 20% right here, is to find a local partner, as one of many examples. But this is one way of funding it. The level of finance I've recommended is a minimum of $500,000 a year, okay, for one agency. Now, if you think about it, oh my God, that's an amazing amount of money. That's probably 2 staff, maybe 2.5, and everything else will just be expensed in terms of just driving the messaging and the attraction strategy and trying to drive business toward Lake County. That $500,000 will be gone quick. There's 3 principles I put forward as success, and I do this in all my projects. First one is to focus on what leads and not what lags. Don't sweat what's happened, accept its context, and you got to focus on what's coming, okay? Because that environment around you is constantly changing. The second thing is to play to your strengths, to try to partner where you can. Don't do things that you're not good at. But at the same time, if you can find a partner who can enhance you a little bit and get you where you want to be, take on those partnerships. Filter that, but take them on, because you're going to have to do more than just one entity can. For example, a classic issue. Cities don't like to partner with other cities or the county, generally speaking. Why? Because cities can sometimes be relatively parochial in the way they look at the tax revenue. Okay? Breaking down those walls is a key piece of this so-called partnership. That's intra-county. Outside, I already talked about Colusa and Lake coming together, one where the opportunity zone is, but just thinking about the very relatively similar places. Thinking about how you can partner. And the other thing is think about 5 years ahead, not 5 years ago. If you get stuck in the past, you're almost absolutely damned to repeat it at the end of the day, okay? Why you want to think 5 years from now is because it might take 5 years to really see the strategy come forward, okay? Infrastructure-wise, the other pieces, you're going to have to wait a little while to get some momentum. So don't get freaked out if the first year doesn't get you exactly where you want to be. Give it a little time. So that's the key. There are a lot of challenges, folks. There's a lot of issues in terms of the messaging. You need to be consistent and be one voice. So in the community forums, I heard a lot of different voices about crime, concerns over infrastructure, not the right housing, not enough hotels, too many hotels. A lot of inconsistency, and that's people drawn at random from the community who came. In the political circles and in the policy circles, everybody's going to have one voice. Go back to the example I just gave. Our cities and the county, one is partners. I know y'all are sitting here today, but think about that going forward. Can you make those partnerships happen and be one solid voice for the county as a whole? Okay. The next is you will have to, in a sense, give up something, and you've already given up a lot. The fires and the reduction of the housing stock have meant lower property taxes. It's just one of many things. The lower flow of people, lower sales taxes, or slower sales taxes. Those things mean that you're going to have to look, where am I going to find the money to make these sort of bets? That's a challenge. There's over the last 6 months and over the last 25 years where I've been either family-wise or otherwise associated with Lake County directly, one of the biggest things is recognizing that Lake County, though usually described as Lake County, has a bunch of different lake counties within it. And you might want to roll the dice and say there's actually 5 different lake counties. And each of the districts has its own differences that need to be accounted for. Well, while you may have different challenges, what that should really do is just lead to a set of challenges that everybody's facing one way or the other. Because if you're in one district, you're adjacent to one that has a different challenge, those things will fold over those borders. They're very porous. So don't get caught up in a lot of that, but it's a challenge to not see that because you can get very, very micro in the way you think. You're kind of starting from behind a little bit. Competition regionally is pretty stiff, and it's gotten more stiff since the recession. So that's okay, though. It means that there's actually probably a little bit more runway here than you would have in other places, but it's a little more competitive. So there's a bit more of a challenge. And we need 1 year without a fire. Right? And I don't mean any fire, because we should assume there's going to be something. But we need one that doesn't have people running from their homes or end up on the news as that, you evacuated 25,000 people from Lakeport and its environs. Right? We need that to not happen for 1 year. Okay? So one thing to think about is the challenge that you're seeing now in Butte County. So as Will just said, I went to Chico State as an undergraduate, and I have a lot of ties in the Chico and Paradise area, and it's been absolutely tragic to watch what's unfolded there, and obviously y'all have been through it here too in different magnitudes. Why is that important? Well, if you go back up here to regionally competitive and some other issues have been going on, guess what? You now have this other regional competition place for construction, home building, federal money, state money, other philanthropic money. When Santa Rosa went through its thing last year, Redwood Credit Union, I'm on the board of Redwood Credit Union, $32 million raised. What did that do to other nonprofits? It sucked some of the money away from them and moved it in another direction. But that's natural. It was an emergency situation. Same thing's happening in Butte County, and it's rearranging the way that funding's taking place. So not only does Santa Rosa and Napa have to do their own rebuilding, and that's a relatively local issue, not that far away is going to have another pull on demand. So if you want Lake County to be rebuilt, which it still needs to in some ways be done, you now have dual competition, 2 geographic areas that have larger magnitude problems in some ways than y'all. So how do you convince in that now more competitive, dubious competition, but still more competitive environment to make that happen? We'll see. So let's walk through what to do the first 2 years as a conclusion. This is what I'm recommending as far as an initial path. Looking for some education grants and trying to get some lab space, whether it's lab in the classic science sense or lab just as a space that you can actually play around. A maker space that's more expansive on the education side, for example. An art space. Things that would actually become attractants, in doing business on the other side. Quasi-entrepreneurial, but something that sees either as workforce or a new business starter, and having the wireless to get her done. Thinking about hospitality. Can we do training programs in the short term? Can we change curricula to be focused on training local workers for hospitality? Hire a grant writer. There's a lot of grant writers in Lake County, but hire one with one focus, and that is to try to drive money to fund these strategies. Okay? And if you already have one, get a second one. Because if you need to look for external funding, you're going to have to get a lot more diligent about it and actually get out there and be competitive. I say identify 25 sites around the county as far as ready to occupy with targeted industries tenants, so a lot of different caveats there. 25 is just what I consider to be a relatively round number. That they need to be ready to occupy is caveat one. Second is you don't want them to be occupied by yet another retailer on the front end. You want retail to get pulled up behind your strategy. You notice that the 4 target industries I talked about, none of them had retail outside of visitor support. Okay? Retail will get pulled behind these strategies naturally as incomes slowly rise up. So you want to think about that in terms of just to the targeted industries and nothing else. Those 2 caveats might be very tough to find 25 sites you like. The funding piece, as I said, for a minimum of 3 years, I think 5 is a more round number, but you all got to figure that out. Who's going to be the lead and how long you're going to make the investment? And then finally, establishing these messages. So this is year 1, right? Establishing a messaging protocol is really the more deep message here. What social media are you going to use? What classic media are you going to use? Who's going to be the messenger? Who's going to filter those messages, especially when something goes wrong? So let's say there is another relatively large fire next year, okay? Who should be the filter of the outbound information on the business side of Lake County to say, we're still in business, it's not that big of a deal. Channel 7 News is worried because there's 40 acres on fire, they've flown a helicopter up here, it's not a big deal, you hit the Twitter button and it goes. And your messaging is consistent and reliable. It takes away the negative, oh, the whole county's on fire again, right? I mean, it's unbelievable the way that people run with stories. One of the things last year that happened is Sonoma County took a long, hard look at tourism messaging because they were very concerned that people coming from all over the world to come to Sonoma County were not going to come anymore because they thought the whole place had turned to ash. So there's this huge amount of messaging that went by. If you can stay consistent, they really tripped over their shoelaces on remaining consistent because they didn't have a plan. There was nobody designated to say, okay, get out of the fire zone, get on 3 screens and start pounding it, that we're still open for business, still open for business. They waited 3 weeks to do that, and it probably cost them 6 months as a result of it. Okay? So having that ready, contingency planning against that messaging, all that are sort of tactics underneath this. In year 2, you want to start making the contacts. When you have all those other pieces ready to go and you feel like you're actually ready to absorb a new business and start that other spin, you want to go out and look for so-called clients. Who's going to come in and be someone you want to support and watch grow here? You need to go out and get it done. Could be somebody that's a side gig or somebody that's bringing a business with them. Could be somebody that just comes here because they think that Lake County is actually going to fit them for exactly the calculus they're looking at, and then attracting the correct workforce. Those messages should already be built in year 1, then you actually go out and find them in year 2. You establish the metrics and make sure you report out on what happened in year 1. You want to track the visitor data and show that what you're doing on the TID side actually is working. It's actually bringing in people. So in terms of that, the new TOT, you want to say that you made the right investment. And you want to contact those universities or those scientists and say, we're now ready to take you on. I said this a little while ago. UCSB, which is nice, it's not that far away, has the top lake science program in the world. Okay? Go down there, have a meeting with them, say what you're going to do for them to bring professors who want to do sabbatical here because they have a research project that, guess what, about a lake, right? Have them come here, bring work with them, say you can actually support them with lab space because you already developed that on year 1, and then everybody comes here in a virtuous cycle. And then what happens, they go away and they go to Lake County, they're ready for you, the science is there. And it happens again and again and again. And that can spin out businesses. So, the 2 big questions that are always there, and this is how I want to leave you. What makes you different, and what's the ROI of having a business here? How are you going to answer those questions? And do it real, and do it seriously. Like, this weekend when you're sitting around with a glass of wine and you're talking about Lake County, ask the people you're sitting with these 2 questions. why would you start a business here? Okay, what's the return on that investment, the so-called ROI? And why are we different? Really? Okay, and just saying, it's quality of life and just keep on trucking, right? Right? Don't hang your hat on that. We've got plenty of evidence to suggest there are hundreds of communities in the western United States who've got the same exact marketing, okay? You got to figure in a very niche way, what can you do, right? Why did I not say aerospace as an attractant? Because what do you have here as an asset? The lake, right? In other words, don't rely on this, in Healdsburg it's funny because they'll say, oh yeah, well, we knew that was going to happen. They had no idea that those folks were coming from General Dynamics. Zero. Super lucky, okay? But they built an environment in which it had a really good chance of happening. That's what y'all are going to do. But if you can't answer these two questions well, 5 years from now you'll be saying, oh, I wonder what happened. Because you didn't answer these two questions well. Okay? So folks, that is what we did. So as far as the process goes, we're going to have people come up to the mic, right, and ask questions, and I'll answer them as necessary. Okay, folks, thank you again, and I want to thank all the partners and your support. This was a wild project because there's a lot of different moving parts. In the summer, we had more issues, and now we have even more issues, but we have a lot of opportunity here. That is the key. Take advantage of those opportunities. Thank you.